Hi everybody, I'm Nick DeWolf and this is a very early one of our shows called the Nick DeWolf Journal. It's going to be about a lot of different things. It's going to surprise me what it's going to be all about, but it'll be a mixture of high tech and low tech and mostly really, hopefully, some adventures. Well, I wanted to tell you about an adventure that sure happened to me last year, just a little while ago, not too long ago. But going back further than that, 50 years ago, my father invited me to New York City, and I rented a tuxedo and I put on a black tie and I sat down and I ate at the Explorers Club in New York a teaspoonful, little bitty teaspoonful of 30,000-year-old woolly mammoth. That was such an adventure, and of course you are what you eat, so within technical limits, I am part woolly mammoth. And that stood me for a long time. I grew very fond of woolly mammoths. So maybe we should have a little look now at the various woolly mammoths that there are. This is a tree of the different woolly mammoths, and it turns out woolly mammoths lived up north. Naturally, they needed it. It was cold up there. But the mammoth we're going to hear about today, it was not a woolly mammoth. In fact, was a Columbian mammoth down here at the bottom of this tree. They were very close, of course, to elephants. This mammoth here, the Mammothusus, is a mythical mammoth, never existed. So there's all sorts of talk about it. But mammoths coexisted with early Homo erectus, our own predecessors. We lived in conjunction, it's now believed, with Piltdown Man was the fake, and that's what we pretend to be at Burning Man. But there was Cro-Magnon, and there were other primitive people back in existence with the mammoths. There's no question what happened to the mammoths. They were not killed by some earthquake. We people ate them up. The mammoth was absolutely delicious, tasted like pork, and there's no doubt we knocked them off. So these are various mammoth skeletons, but here's my favorite. And any of you that become mammoth fans, as I am, don't miss the La Brea Tar Pits in LA. The La Brea Tar Pits contain this lady, and she is absolutely beautiful. When you think about mammoth, you really think about tusks. And I got extra aware of it, as you'll see later, that the tusk is what makes the mammoth. The trunk is what makes an elephant, but the tusk at least makes a mammoth skeleton. So, here's a little interesting side thing. Mammoths and elephants both walk on tiptoe. Their bones are covered with a kind of a horn-like material, so they look like they're clopping along, but they're really tiptoeing along. Here are what happened to me. I learned that Burning Man, which is this event in the desert, has art carts all over the place, and the largest mammoth ever found on Earth was found right where we do Burning Man, in the Nevada desert near Reno. So I just had to build a mammoth skeleton, a party vehicle, as an art cart for this incredible Burning Man adventure. Later on, on this show, you'll see lots more about Burning Man. So I set some objectives. Our mammoth would, above all, magically drift, just coast, very slowly, mysterious, a platform with a skeleton, not making any sense what made her move. She would have huge tusks with no wires and no supports. All those museums have the tusks wired to the ceiling. She's a theater, a club, an entertainment place. You would see my Burning Man show, which will be on this show in due course, and drink mammoth milk. You would be ensconced, and now came the hard part. The ribs surrounding you, I was determined, and we scored on this one, the ribs would breathe. So you would be living inside a breathing skeleton. That was our objective. We underestimated a few of the problems. She had to survive 70-mile-an-hour gales, and I underestimated that one. We rehearsed the procedures for those storms. We wanted to control her almost in a secret fashion so nobody would quite know. So no great big steering wheels and rudders and complicated steering machines. She had to use generators. We'll see more about that later. They were meant to be and intended to be very quiet. And she would run everything except crawling across the desert. She would be able to do everything that she was capable of doing on batteries for 24 hours so that at night we wouldn't have any generators running at all.
You're watching Grassroots Community TV, Channel 12, Aspen, leaders in the riffraff movement since 1971.
Hi everybody, this is Nick DeWolf on Nick's Journal. This is part B of the Burning Man Mammoth story, which started 50 years ago in New York City when I put on a black tie, very rare event, and went to the Explorers Club, a snooty little club, and tasted a 30,000-year-old woolly mammoth, a little tiny teaspoon. It was delicious, tasted like pork. Well, years go by. I am part mammoth, of course, all these years as a result. And I discovered that at Burning Man, which many of you may not know what Burning Man is, but it's an incredible art event in the desert, a week of crazed people in the worst desert in America, and full of art carts and wonderful artistic endeavors. And I decided I could not resist. I had to build a mammoth as a creature. And then I discovered that Burning Man's desert, right at the edge of the desert, that very spot where the biggest mammoth ever found was pulled out of the mud and is in the museum in Reno. So that was a cinch. I had to build a mammoth. So the story picks up again, where we're building the tusks for the mammoth out of these discs that you'll shortly see. This is me wallowing around in the disc refuse pile. As you can sort of gather, the tusks were built by putting one disc on top of another at an angle and a twist, and we had never seen such a thing done before. The tusks were fiberglass, sort of like you'd bandage a leg, round and round and round and round, and 8 layers of fiberglass down at the root of the rib, of the tusk, pardon me. The point being that in a mammoth, the most important part of the skeleton is the tusk. If we don't have a jazzy tusk, we haven't got a mammoth, we've just got some kind of old horse. So a lot of effort went into this. I insisted that we wrap the a bandage round and round and round the leg. To my horror, here are pictures, which I started taking these pictures of the work crew, and I didn't realize it as I took these pictures that they'd taken a pair of scissors and they were starting to try to bandage her with short strips. Oh boy, that was a near disaster. If we'd done that, the tusks would never have worked. So we had to back up and redo it all. But we wrapped the tusks round and round and round with many, many, many layers of fiberglass. So she was pretty heavy. Those tusks weighed 50 pounds apiece. But if we hadn't done it this way, they would have weighed many hundreds of pounds apiece. They were 20 feet long, each made out of 120 of those discs. Then, of course, came the problem of the root of the tusk. And we used birch plywood, very good quality, for the roots sort of across in the middle of the tusk. And then we had a great idea. There was no way that I figured we could bolt the tusk to the creature stiffly and still take the huge winds we'd have to stand. So I considered hinges so that when the wind blew, the tusks would flop around, and we realized they were so big and heavy they'd actually tip the creature over. That wouldn't do. Then we had a big question. Will drunks come along and sit on the tusk? And sure they will, and they'll break it off. And once you break the root of the tusk, we were stuck that we would never be able to get it up again. So I actually put shear pins in the root of the tusk, a little like on an outboard motor. When you hit a rock, your propeller doesn't break. It breaks loose and the motor spins without spinning the propeller. Then you put in a new shear pin. Well, none of my co-workers liked the idea very much, and I had to fight like a dog to use shear pins, but we did do that. Here we are with a very skilled welder guy, wonderful fella, who built the pieces of steel that we would put these famous shear pins in to hold the tusks. We'd never done this before, and nothing that we did we'd ever done before. It was all new to us, so we were pretty nervous. Everything was experimental. But as the tusks went up, our spirits began to lift. Here we are. Here's the work crew all holding the tusk rather delicately. We have no idea if this is going to work. It's probably going to snap off. So Luke is holding the tusk, and I insisted that it was my privilege to break the tusk. And I cannot tell you, we'd worked almost 2 months to build these tusks. Here I am holding the tusk up, and as I slowly lower it, I was not sure it wouldn't just snap right off. But it didn't. The tusks held up beautifully, and to our own surprise, we weathered 40-mile-an-hour winds at Burning Man without breaking any shear pins. So here our mammoth begins to get tusks. She's already got some ribs. These tusks were just built from a mathematical model, and I would love to show the model again, just briefly, because I think it was kind of so interesting. This corny little bent piece of wire with some hunks of blue foam on it, I carefully measured the gaps between each of these, and from those was able to calculate just how much each of these discs should be tilted so that the whole tusk would turn around as a three-dimensional tusk. It was quite a trick to do that. So we'll go back again. Here we are with the ribs, and the mammoth is beginning to take shape. Her head was papier-mâché, not big enough, but we had that to learn. Next time she'll have a bigger head, I'm sure. Now we come to the really complicated part, which was the controls and the animations to make her move, and above all, to make her breathe. The control box I had considered, of course, using integrated circuits and computer chips and all of the new way to do stuff. And I decided not to, that I could accomplish the logic I wanted just by using relays, old-fashioned relays. And the other great advantage is the relays were strong enough to carry the huge currents involved in animating her. I had to decide about exactly what the control box would have, and here's the picture of it. This little dinky thing here would control that giant mammoth completely. This was left, right, go fast, go slow, change gears, and honk the horn. So that's pretty much what the controls were. Brakes we didn't need. We knew that she'd come to a stop all on her own in about 2 feet. In fact, might even throw people overboard when we brought her to a stop. Here we are building this control apparatus that was required for the mammoth. Again, way underestimated. It took me nearly a month to build that and kept me from properly supervising the work crew. I must confess, when I finished this control box, I was so choked up at having finally finished it that I broke down and cried. It was like it was like the end of a battle to build it. Here's the control box back in Aspen, covered with dust from the Burning Man experience, and that gives you some idea of the environment we're in. We're just always in dust. She held up well. Now, how to animate the legs? So I wanted the legs to move in a graceful fashion, and I went to see some elephants. And when I watched elephants walk in their beautiful lumbering gait, I knew I could never properly imitate an elephant's gait. So I decided I would not have flexible knees. She would be rather stiff-legged and look like she was kind of creaking around, but at least we'd get the legs to move. It was way too complicated to have the legs move properly. As we calculated the legs and the ribs, we were very surprised by some of the things we learned. One of the things we learned was that the motors we needed, which I had hoped to use way tiny motors, were way underpowered. And the reason is that in order to get a leg swinging or a rib swinging, even in your own body, it's the same rules, the energy required is really required to get the acceleration of starting your leg to move. In other words, keeping your leg moving like a pendulum is easy, but getting it to move quick enough took a lot more energy. So I had to switch the motors we used, and we had started with windshield wiper motors, and we wound up with a lot heavier motors. Here are another big problem we had was we underestimated how to hook a motor to the ribs, and it was just a really endless challenge how to get the motor to actually twist the spine to twist the ribs and the legs. Now, I think maybe I'm going to want to explain this in my hands a little bit, but I wanted the animation to run without any generators, to run off batteries, and that meant that I wanted it to really be efficient. The ribs would move, the legs would swing, all off batteries. And in fact, to my amazement, we wound up with a system that was very satisfactory, and she ran 18 hours on a single automobile battery, back and forth, including the lights. A lot of planning went into this. I used hundreds and hundreds of file cards to calculate the whole creature. If I hadn't done that, we never would have been able to build her. Then we had this great invention. We would have this offset crank which would be weighted so that we could counterbalance the ribs without a heavy apparatus. It didn't work at all. We wound up hanging gallon jugs of water up in the air off the ribs. One of the reasons for the gallon jugs of water, if they fell and hit anybody, they wouldn't be as likely to kill them as a hunk of concrete would have been. We had some trouble figuring out batteries. It's sort of a secret how much capacity a battery has. You have to do a lot of asking around because the battery makers don't tell you the capacity of their batteries for some reason. They just tell you in battery terms. So then how do we mount the ribs and how do we drive the ribs? Well, it was pretty tough. Classical micro switches are unreliable, so I switched to burglar alarm magnets, which were a lot better, much more reliable. Maybe I might explain this with my hands, the rib animation logic. What was the logic? This may seem like a detail, but an incredible amount of thinking went into such a simple thing as this. How did we make the ribs move in and out so that while you were inside partying and having a good time, you'd feel like you were in a living skeleton? Well, here's the logic that we used. After the power is applied, both of the sides moved outwards until either one hit its own particular limit switch. That message then sent both of them coming back inwards again in the opposite direction, and when either one hit, then it would stop and wait for the other one to hit. They weren't simultaneous, and then it would wait until both sides had stopped, and then we'd start out again, and the ribs would move like this. That logic does not require integrated circuits or computers or any such thing. It can be done with relays. But it's surprisingly difficult to come up with a relay circuit to do it. And the lights we expected would light in synchronism with that. So then one of the problems with such a thing, and this doesn't demonstrate it, but this drawing will kind of be a hint at some of the complexities there are. It is possible to build such a logic so it'll latch somewhere and never run again. So it would be very wise, and if you try this, that you exhaustively study every single possibility from a starting point, and you'll discover some of them simply won't work. This drawing here is interesting. This is the ribs. This is how the ribs this is the language of electrical engineers. When you're used to this, you draw the drawing, and this drawing is the same logic I just described to you. Each of these is switches and relays and stuff doing their work. That simple looking circuit is all I needed, but again, it took quite a while to come up with. Now, that's a circuit diagram. Doesn't look like the objects look, and it doesn't tell you what the logic is. It's just a whole other language almost. Here will come up actually what it looked like. This crazy thing is the bottom edge of the relays, and that's what the wiring looks like. And if I were to ask you to wire it for me, I'd give you a diagram like that. You wouldn't understand how it worked or what the circuit was. The legs were very similar and followed in the same pattern. The leg controls were very similar. And here we have the legs as they moved, turning the lights on and off in the legs, hopefully. We actually didn't get all of that work going. Okay. Now, why didn't we nod and move her head? Why didn't we have her head nod back and forth? Well, because it was just too much. Again, as you learned in the earlier show, perhaps, I thought we could build the Mammoth in 2 months. It took us every minute we had of 8 months, and we barely finished just at the end of the Burning Man adventure. The lighting, I passionately dislike tungsten lights. Well, it's hopeless to provide any serious amount of tungsten lights from batteries. So we wired her all up from LEDs. And at the end of this statement, I thank Harvey, because Harvey Branscombe, who subsequently has inherited the Mammoth, Harvey did a great job, bless him, in the heat of the desert, getting the light bulbs all hooked up and working so that I could focus on the mechanisms working. Here's the guts of the lighting system. This tiny little LED, you've certainly seen plenty of them, are brighter than, they're just amazingly bright, like these little keychain lights that will actually blind you if you look at them with very little current. That's the future of lighting, all kinds of lighting. Here's my work crew, had the simple task, I thought they could do it in a couple of days, of wiring up 500 light bulbs, one at a time. We also built some printed circuit boards and some circuitry like this to light up our camp, so that at night we could sit around and drink beer or whatever without having to use up too much electricity. There's a lot of thinking that can go into something as simple as LED lights. We even thought through what wire gauge to use. Electricians don't do this, they just follow the government regulations, but we didn't have any regulations, hot damn. So we could wire things with very much finer wire Well, we couldn't have done the job if we had to use, well, it would have been a major pain if we had to use heavy wire. Mammoth milk. We had lots of ideas for mammoth milk, and I was ready to make up a concoction, but we wound up settling for pearl coconut sake, which actually is quite tasty. And more popular than that were our white painted pure alcohol steeped watermelons. What we would do is just pour raw naked alcohol, whack in a watermelon, and and then we painted them white, and those were pterodactyl eggs. Remember that we were primitive people living at the same time as the mammoths. Here's our saber-toothed tiger. Jim Belknap, my partner, did a wonderful job with this, and we decorated our ATV, all-terrain vehicle, which was our extra vehicle. We decorated her as Mam's saber-toothed tiger pets. You see, Mammoth, the Mam, she's a vegetarian and wouldn't threaten us very much, but if we misbehaved, she'd feed us to the saber-toothed tiger cat, who was definitely not a vegetarian. Typical visitors, this gal was wonderful. She thought the little cat was cute. We bought this truck, it's a U-Haul. This is a historic thing. It's a piece of the Aspen music tent, which we inherited and were to use in our camp as a sentimental connection to Aspen. Long to-do lists, they went on, but we returned to Aspen in the middle of building it to do the Burning Man show that many of you may have seen. It was 1,600 photographs of Burning Man, and what we had people do, it was sort of fun, on the way into the show, we didn't explain anything. We told them that they had to wear this dust mask, which we provided for them. And here are pictures of the whole Wheeler Opera House wearing a dust mask with no idea why they're wearing a dust mask. I explained it was, of course, to stop the spread of SARS. Well, a question everybody asks me is, how much money did we spend? And I have an answer for that, and it's none of your darn business how much money we spent, but we spent a lot of money. Every time I turned around, we'd go to the hardware store, and there would go another 400 bucks. It was quite amazing how we kept having yet another idea and another idea. A lot of it had to do with building a camp. We bought 7 bicycles so that our people who couldn't get a bicycle there could have a bicycle. Here's our very snooty 6-wheel ATV machine. That's an astounding thing. It'll go straight up a cliff and was very, very handy. Where Jim lives is very much a vertical cliff anyway, so we almost needed it just to get our own stuff together. But of course, here's the work crew. And this, of course, is the most expensive part of all, our people. This is payday. And payday went on for 6 months, which I had not expected. So finally, we're off to Burning Man. Here we go. We leave Cripple Creek, we load up for the trip, and we arrive on the desert after a long trip and begin throwing, the bits and pieces of the mammoth begin to appear. There goes her ribs up into the air, and along comes a dust storm. This is pretty funny. This guy was one of the Rockefeller Center, I think, and he just walked past. This is very typical of Burning Man. All kinds of wonderful artworks take place. Here we are at night, slaving away, because it was much nicer to work at night. As anyone knows, the desert's actually cold at night and hot enough in the daytime to make serious work hard to do. Here it is, here we are in the daytime. These are tracks that we've been making in the desert, and now we begin to see the mammoth. And early one morning, this gal appeared. I was working away in the wonderful cool of the early morning, and she did yoga, I guess, yoga. And as is a Burning Man tradition, she was nice enough to take off her top, just so that the mammoth could be honored by a proper Burning Man burner. I guess she sort of looks like a mammoth, all right. I've gotten so used to her that I still think of her as all the problems we had building her, but, and so as we sat there on the desert, finally we saw the creature I had remembered from the previous year. This was my proposed mate for the mammoth. This dragon I really respected tremendously, and I thought if I could build a mammoth that was adequate to woo this dragon, then I had really accomplished something. However, my mammoth, being part elephant, of course, fell in love with the Bollywood elephant, and what happened was that as we were proceeding through the process, Mam got one look at that sexy elephant, and she made a run for him. And I had the floorboards lifted, and she knocked me down, and I got my leg stuck in with a screw, grabbed hold of it. and I very nearly was killed by my own artwork. That was pretty romantic. I thought it was something if I would wind up mowed down by my own artwork. Here's a drawing I made of a pregnant mammoth with a little mammoth inside. This is my daughter who came to Burning Man, great. And this was definitely not my daughter, but it was the spirit of Burning Man. So here she is in the daytime. And then up comes the dust storm. And in the dust storm, you never quite know what to expect. In fact, dust storms can be absolutely brutal. What do you do when there's a dust storm? It's not clear. So, if you're sensible, you're prepared for the dust storm. The theatrical show's hard drive choked and died after 2 days in a dust storm because probably many of you don't know this, a hard drive depends on air. The head of a hard drive actually floats on air, and floating on dust is not good for it. It should be easy to filter the computer, but we didn't do it adequately. Our projector screener, the whole point of the Mammoth was to project this show up on a screen in front while you were inside enjoying yourself. And of course that jammed up in the dust. It seems like it's working okay, and next year we'll have to build a box with all sorts of filters in it to keep the dust out. But we did pretty much survive it. What happens if it rains? Oh, God, if it rains, the playa, which is our name for the desert dust, turns into glue, a gooey mass of it. The only thing you can do is stop. Don't try to move. In fact, I've been told that I never experienced a real rainstorm in the desert, but your feet stick in the stuff just like glue, and you can hardly walk when the rain comes. So the rules were that if the rain comes, we will stop and wait for her to dry out. Here we are in the daytime, and then came the lamplighters every evening. They were absolutely wonderful, and they light up the lamps, and night falls upon the Mammoth. Here's our 500 light bulbs. This is one of my favorite pictures of her because it's kind of the spirit I'd wanted. And mind you, the ribs are moving, and in a minute we'll see that that's quite interesting. This picture is very interesting. It's a time exposure, which of course they have to be, and you can see the tracks of the lights. And it tells you that the ribs are moving in and out about every couple of seconds. And that was just about felt like she was breathing all around you. We had an interesting event. We had had trouble having her go long. In other words, travel. She didn't travel well at all. We didn't know what to do about it. And at this point, suddenly some drummers showed up and said, "Hey, do you mind if we drum inside your Mammoth?" And I said, "Oh, that's just perfect. Please do." So we switched signals and anchored the Mammoth and became a drummer's station for entertaining people. Here's some more night pictures of her. You could see those bent tusks from about 2 miles away. So she became a wonderful landmark for people that were lost. And it is very easy to get lost because you're in a great big flat spot at night. And if you don't have lights to guide you, you won't see a thing. We had no moon. It was totally moonless. Well, here's where I thought maybe I would face the truth. Did our motive power scheme succeed? In other words, the thing that would drive her invisibly across the desert. Well, it didn't succeed very well. We really did have enough power, enough energy, enough push to conquer the desert. We proved she'd move, we proved she'd turn acceptably, but we really didn't reach our goal, which was 3 round trips a day to the furthest edges of Burning Man. We would have had to have done that by abandoning ship, constantly jumping overboard and pushing, and I thought that was undignified. So we really didn't succeed in a graceful trip. What went wrong? Well, we used 1/2-inch threaded rods for axles. They were bent. Our axles actually bent on us. That was a big surprise. Her pillow blocks, which carried the pulleys, were way too soft, and they let the chains of the motors slip. So we started having slipping chains. Our wheels were too narrow, and they were too hard. They dug into the desert because they were a bit too much like sharp edges and not enough like a gooey thing. There's still some mysteries in why the push on the wheels was uneven, but a lot of the weight was carried by the wrong wheels, and so that wasn't a good idea. It's going to be quite an effort to make her properly accomplish the original objectives. I feel MAM was an 80% success measured against our original goals, even if she never got to drift around the desert. Our switch to a performance platform saved our honor, And Jim Belknap, my partner, kept the show going for at least 2 nights, which was at our objective. Her appearance was pretty much the way we intended. I think her head was a little too small. Not museum quality, but Burning Man quality. Here are some more pictures of her at night, and this was the main thing I wanted to accomplish. I wanted to accomplish her seeing the man, and this guy over here is the man of Burning Man. And she was definitely present for the event, which is the burning of the Burning Man. There he goes, up in flames, with a very spectacular fireworks display. And finally, just after that, the temple burned. So there it is, the story of the mammoth. And here we are back in Aspen with our beloved original woolly mammoth. That is what we ate. And I wanted to show you a few other little tidbits. This is a mammoth tooth. And the mammoth ate by grinding her food, not by chomping on it, because her food was grass. So there's a petrified mammoth tooth, obtained from eBay, of course, had been found in the Netherlands. Here's a piece of mammoth tusk, a small mammoth. And the tusk is actually a fairly sophisticated piece of work, but I was intrigued that a tusk is not too far unlike what we build out of fiberglass. It's strong on the outside and has growing material on the inside. It's the only way that such a long, when you imagine it, a real mammoth tusk has a big problem in the materials that it uses. Here's a much heavier, oh, by the way, real mammoth tusks are as long as our tusk was, but boy, they weigh a lot more. Our tusk weighed about 50 times less. Here's a hip bone of a not huge mammoth, and I kind of like this thing. It's kind of my friend. I feel very close to mammoths, and I'm absolutely sure, once again, that I am part mammoth. So there's our story of the building of the Mammoth for Burning Man. It has one last little tiny tidbit. Harvey Branscombe from Aspen has taken on the responsibility for the mammoth, and it's his baby. So whatever happens to her next year is up to Harvey, and we accomplished whatever it is that we accomplished. So we'll see you again on the next Nick's Journal show. Whenever we stopped. Those were the objectives. And here was our first design. Our first design involved bar stools on the top. You see, and you'd sit up here and have a beautiful view of this incredible Burning Man adventure in the desert, climb up this little ladder here, kind of go and get on the bar stool, and then we realized what would happen to you. You sure as heck would go, woo, come sailing off the bar stool, half drunk, most of the people there, and get badly hurt because they'll be 15 feet in the air. So we gave up the bar stools, but we did attach this bicycle rack at her tail end. Later on, we were thinking about pushing them because you're at Burning Man, you're on a bicycle, and you don't want to yield up your bicycle to come and party because your bicycle is pretty vital. So we said, we'll just provide a mobile parking lot and you'll have your bike when you leave us. That design stood the test of time, and we set out to build that mammoth. Why is she so close to the desert? Why isn't she way up in the air on a truck like everybody else would do? Well, because I wanted it to be magic, and that's part of what Burning Man is about. It's us techie types trying to do stuff that's real cool that you can't quite understand how it works. So many times I was wooed to raise her off the desert a little higher. It'd be much easier to do it, and I just didn't want that. Another small detail which turned out important is you couldn't fall under it if she's low enough. And lo and behold, with great sadness, a woman was killed at Burning Man that year by falling under an art cart and getting mushed. Well, we kept resizing it, recounting the number of ribs, changing the dimensions. We kept going round and round and round. But we wound up with a mammoth who from tusk to tail was 44 feet long. Holy mackerel, that was a lot bigger than I thought. But we found that if we make her just a little bigger, she looks better, but a little smaller would be easier, and so that was our compromise. She was actually a little smaller than the real mammoth. The real mammoth was about 20% bigger than our mammoth. The real mammoth was really huge. The real mammoth, by the way, ate 500 pounds a day of grass. So she was no. Now, we finally finished her around January. We had 7 months to go. We couldn't miss it. 7 months, my goodness, I thought we could build her in about a month or two. Well, the fact is, we finished the mammoth 2 days before the end of Burning Man, and we just had 2 days of her functioning properly. So we barely made it. Now we came to a chapter that was very hard on me. I had thrown my hat in the ring, told everybody we were going to do it. There was no way that I was going to back out and not attempt to build this mammoth. But it was way too big for my house. My wife would have thrown me out forever if I had attempted to build the mammoth there. So we had to move off to Cripple Creek, Colorado, where my friend Jim Belknap had a barn that we would build the mammoth in. And above all, he could find construction workers to help us build her, because there's a great shortage here in Aspen. So we went on to Cripple Creek. Here's a map of Cripple Creek, and Independence Pass is over here, and Cripple Creek's in here. It's an old mining town, fascinating history in Colorado, and still a very small town, sort of in some ways a little bit like Aspen was 30 years ago. Up over Independence Pass, yeah, oh boy, when the winter came, that was tough. It suddenly added 4 more hours to the trip. Then, that winter, in March, came the biggest snowfall in the history of Colorado. Many of you don't remember it, but it was really tough at Cripple Creek. And the snowfall was so huge that it actually collapsed the barn and the mammoth. So we started out with a mound of snow and no barn. And Jim, bless him, got this barn built in 3 weeks with just 3 old geezer guys, over 60, with hammers and nails, really knew what they were doing, prefabbed, and that swell barn is the birthplace, the womb of our mammoth. So now we'll go on to how we propose to propel her. I wanted the propulsion to be magical, and 20 passengers, which was the goal, is 6,000 pounds of people. We needed, I figured, while she was crawling along the ground, we needed about 125 pounds of push. And when you calculate that out, instead of just saying build it and see how it turns out, it's only a horsepower. It doesn't take much power to push a big weight as long as everything is flat and nothing mires down. In fact, the Seattle restaurant in the top of the turning thing in Seattle only uses 1 horsepower to move hundreds of people around, an entire restaurant. So I determined that we would really stinge her for power, and we used 8 quarter horsepower motors, 2 horsepower max, each one with a lot of torque, way geared down, and that would propel us at 3 miles an hour and a maximum of 3 miles an hour. The speed limit at Burning Man is 5 miles an hour, so we really didn't want to go any faster than a nice little walk. Every one of the wheels that were attached to that motor were all driven, so she was a 32-wheel driven machine. How could she use such little power as 2 horsepower? Everybody else would think of a couple of 100 horsepower. Well, cars use a lot of horsepower because they have to accelerate. They have to go boom, 0 to 60 in 8 seconds flat, or you wouldn't buy the car. And in turn, at 60 or 70 miles an hour, the windage is quite severe, as I well knew because my mammoth would blow over in a wind of that size. So we're accelerating 100 times slower than a car, and we're going 20 times slower. Therefore, we did not run out of horsepower. Well, then why don't we solar power it? Hot darn, we'll just hook up a few solar cells. Well, that's not practical. For solar cells to work and have any fun at it on the desert, we would have needed 25 solar cells. And we realized, batteries, 25 big truck batteries. That was no thanks. Here's a solar cell that wouldn't even have charged the batteries for our light bulbs. Then, what did we use? Of course, we had to use a generator. These generators are the quietest generators you can buy, about 3 kilowatts, which is the order of a couple of horsepower. Unfortunately, even they are fairly noisy. What many of you don't realize is your car has a very quiet, a lot of muffling and cleverness goes on in a car. So that 100 horsepower engine is almost as quiet as a 3 or 4 horsepower generator. Here was our first design. The motors would be up on top, and we were going to use rollers and roll it along like the pharaohs rolled the pyramids. However, our first roller was built so badly that we learned quickly it's very hard to build a really good roller. We drove it with chains, almost of course, because chains let you be very sloppy, and we're not very good machinists, so we could use a chain drive. And when I saw this sprocket, which says saber-tooth sprockets, well, we knew we had to use them, because the saber-tooth tiger, as you'll soon learn, was our pet. Here, we wanted to use idlers. We had all kinds of ideas. Everybody kept telling us to use bigger wheels. We were determined not to do that. Pneumatic tires would have been nice, but they don't make them small enough. The kind of tires we wanted, we just couldn't find them. So we wound up with a tire like this. They were very cheap, hard, solid rubber, and casters, which were our undoing. Many of you know when you push a, well, you all know, when you push a table that has casters on it, it doesn't turn very easily. Wouldn't it be nice to have springs so we could go up and down, boing, 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 but we couldn't do that with only 6 inches of clearance off the desert. Literally 6 inches was all we were off the desert. Now the starting torque. How do we get enough energy to get started when the whole thing has come to a stop? And as all of you know, it's harder to push a car and get it moving than it is to keep it moving. So we had some very clever inventions, and I would love to explain this to you. A lot of this may seem like technical detail, but again, there's a reason why I wanted to explain this to you, and that is that I want you to understand how much detail it takes to figure out something as simple as this when it's never been done before. I had invented this, I thought, super clever idea where I would put motors in series, and each motor then could share the same current from the generator and the controller when it was going slowly. And then when we got up to speed, we would start to connect these up in parallel. It wouldn't push as hard, but it would push faster. So we'd have a lot of torque to get her underway. Well, many of you know, and many of the cars you own, not four-wheel drives that are done properly, but some of the earlier cars, if a single wheel, even a four-wheel drive, slips, the whole car won't move. You've surely had the experience where one wheel is spinning around in the mud and the car won't move. And all the other wheels don't have any strength. Same is true for my super clever invention. And of course, one of the wheels slipped and the others had no torque at all. So that was a bummer. And we abandoned my, I thought, very clever gear shifting idea. Here's a little explanation of it in a circuit diagram for those of you inclined. This would have all the motors in series, and this would have all the motors in parallel. And they would have a 16-to-1 difference in their ability to have speed or torque. Well, then another scheme, of course, we need more current. We don't have enough current. Oh, dear me, when we're starting. There's no voltage on the motors. We can start as long as we have juice. So I was thinking about boosting up the works with a battery. And the battery will deliver, as it does in a car, huge starting currents, but not at much voltage, so that we would be able to go, oof, and give a jerk to get started. I decided if we did that, we'd throw everybody overboard, and that wouldn't be very polite, so we didn't do that. Now I'll show you some pictures of the framework of what we built. Here is a very expert welder we took on. He was a competitively successful welder, and he welded up our framework. You can see here the motors. These are quarter horsepower geared down motors. This is, okay. This is the little wheels that ran. And here he is working away. He was really, really skilled and expensive, by the way. But we couldn't weld. Welding really is a very high order skill. Then we built her in four. This is Jim Belknap, my partner in crime on the whole project, did a wonderful job. It was a very stressful project because, as I think I've already told you, we thought we could do it in a couple of months. Here is a close-up of the sprockets and the wheels and stuff. And again, I've been endlessly teased that these wheels are too small. I know they're not too small, but they were a little narrow and they were a little stiff. These are hard rubber, and I wish they'd had a little more give. On this pebbly rocks, I actually was able to push our whole monster all by myself. But when we got to the desert, we found that we could not, because the desert sank in enough to make it much harder to push. This is one of the few photographs I kept, that's amazing to me, of the whole works of the underpinning carriage. And I don't know if you can see it on the TV, but these casters, these were casters that rotated as we turned. Back here were the drive motors and the drive shafts, and casters again at the end. These are the guys that really dug into the desert and carried a lot of the weight. And part of the reasons why our torque was low from the motors, because they would skid since the casters carried our load. I didn't, and I still don't quite understand this, but I know we have to rethink the whole business about the casters and the drive wheels. And that's part of the problem. We built this, took it to Burning Man, stuck it on the desert, and away we went, and we never were able to test it in anything close to these conditions. And whenever you do any new project, Grassroots, even this program and how we hook the pictures up to the screen, you really have to test it. You have to try it out, and then something goes wrong, and then you have another invention, and you try that out, and it goes wrong. We went for broke. We just plain were smarty pants, and we said, we'll do it our way, and it'll work. I had some problem with the people I was working with, because they said, the hell with it, build it, and don't even think about how it's going to work. You're going to see we did a lot of engineering here. Every piece of this was calculated. Now, here's an exception to the calculation. This we couldn't calculate. We just had to go on faith, and that was the turning question. All my friends said, you've had it. She'll never turn, because she's got these great long sort of like rollers instead of four wheels, and no steering for them. In a car, now I'll explain here, in a car, when you turn your front wheels and cramp them when you're parking the car, you don't realize it, but you're definitely skidding. Either the front wheels or the back wheels, or all four, skid when you make that turn. Here's an ideal, a tank. I thought, oh boy, smarty pants, I'll just put one set of wheels forward, one set of wheels backwards, and we'll be able to just spin around on a dime. Ha ha, fat chance. We don't have nearly enough energy to spin around on a dime. So, and because we have rollers, we do not have anything close to the motor that a tank has, which will drag itself around. So I knew that we couldn't do that, and my friend said she'll never turn. Well, what we did then was, and we considered even putting the rollers, the axles at slight angles, so that she would tend to turn if we ran one set and didn't run the other set. That was too sophisticated, we skipped that. The way we decided to turn was that we would drive the outside wheels and not drive the inside wheels. There is even a way to electrically brake electric motors. We decided that would probably be too much, and we still had no idea if it would turn. Let me go back here to an important calculation we made. The main thing is that everybody wanted her to turn in about a 20-foot radius, which a car will do, so that we could go zooming around and park it somewhere. I said, wait a minute, Burning Man's a whole mile across. This is the place we were to be. We really only kind of want to dribble around Burning Man, go and visit various places, and we could be, especially if the skipper is a little anticipation. So I calculated that we'd be happy enough if we had a 300-foot turning radius, which is very gradual. You'd hardly be able to see it in less than 50 feet or so of movement. Well, here is a picture coming up that's magical. This is a picture of the only time we really had a good run for it on the Burning Man Desert. And at this point, as we were going along here about 2 miles an hour, I said, now please turn, which meant these wheels drive, these wheels just coast. She turned like an absolute charm. Nyop, nyop. Much sharper than I'd ever expected. However, one little episode occurred here. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little white glob over here. And that white glob is an elephant. And in the turning experiment, our mammoth fell in love with this elephant. So that's the next part of our story. Now we have to build, of course, now we have to build the bones. So how are we going to build the bones? Well, I thought we were going to build the bones out of foam. Foam is great stuff. You squirt it out of a can or out of a big can and go tsh, tsh, and then you just kind of mold it maybe with your hands, and then you could kind of shape it a little bit, and then you've got this wonderful kind of bubbly foam mammoth. That's what I thought. Well, the first time we tried to stick our hands in the foam and mold it, it sticks to your fingers. It sticks to anything you do. You can't mold foam. It's got a mind of its own. Try it sometime. You'll be surprised. So we gave up on doing it in foam, and also now came a big mistake on my part. I had figured how to build the mammoth just standing there like a museum would have it, a beautiful looking skeleton, I'd hope. Well, I ignored the storms. In the desert, the storms are not unusual at 70 miles an hour. They don't hit 90 usually, but they hit 70. That's a real gale. That's hurricane force. We did have 50-mile-an-hour storms when we were there. Some years, 70. So I didn't know how much push is 70 miles an hour. How terrible is it? 70 miles an hour, I went on the internet, I asked my friends, nobody had any idea. So I built a kind of a hunk of plywood with a stick on it, and I stuck it out a car window with a spring on it. We drove along, and we got up to 70, and you can imagine a square foot of plywood at 70. It's pulling pretty hard. So then I figured, what would the push on our poor mammoth be? And it is something. We could not sail our mammoth tusks first into a 70-mile-an-hour wind, or the tusk would fly right off and go to California. The ribs would fly off. What we would have to do is we'd have to have storm procedures, which we did work out, and sail her tail first into such a wind. Then all the ribs, we would have lost them. So we decided that we would start building the ribs out of a far more high-tech system. We had to make them light. We couldn't make them heavy, or we'd never be able to move the ribs. So we built her the way you would build a windsurfer. Okay, so we built her out of fiberglass. And fiberglass comes in all kinds. We studied all kinds of fiberglass, and frankly, and I had wanted at one point, the spine had to be straight because we're going to tilt the ribs by tilting the spine. But I had hoped that we could have a spine way up in the air. It turns out a lot of different designs, and we wound up with the spine quite a bit lower. We did calculations galore on how to, oh my God, we even used calculus. And we wound up testing, breaking bits and pieces and doing that. None of the workers I worked with had ever been on a project where you did tests and did math. They just pretty much are used to building things. We finally settled on how to build ribs and how to build tusks, and I'll take you through these pictures rather quickly of us building our first ribs out of a blue foam like you've seen often in housing projects here. This is me equipped to avoid the fumes, which we later got braver about, and we did not wear masks. Nobody got hurt. I wound up actually liking fiberglass. It's a great material to build stuff from because you're not restricted. Here's our work crew. We had 14 of these things to build. Now we had to attach them somehow. That was another big engineering challenge. But here are some pictures of ribs with their attachment apparatus, which are these funny little S-springs. And by springing the ribs, we were able to keep the ribs from falling apart when a windstorm came along. So the ribs were very successful. Those are a kind of horrible looking thing. And then we had an omen. Suddenly one night the moon came out and these cloud formations showed up, and they said to us, go for it, you're doing all right, the Lord is with you. Those were rib-shaped clouds. So we mounted the ribs on the creature, and we got set to head off for the ribs, and then we of course had to do tusks. And the tusk technique we used was this. I had a million different methods, but we made the tusks from discs. And the discs were discs of foam like this. But how in the world do you design the disc of foam and get each disc tilted and twisted and so forth to make a tusk come out right? Well, here's what I did. And by the way, this is the final drawing for a tusk. The tusks were actually built from this drawing. It doesn't look like a tusk. I had to build this model, and I'm not even sure I can hold it exactly straight here, but this model, when it's held just right, is the actual shape of the tusks we wanted, curved round, and the other one curved the other way. So I used this tiny little thing and took a ruler and measured off these little air spaces And from this little model, we were able to build all of the patterns and designs which resulted in the final creature. Here's bits and pieces, and here we are enjoying them. They were very comfy to lie in. We built the tusks, and then we had to fiberglass them and wrap them round and round in a circular style, sort of like you'd fix a broken leg. So I suspect we're now running short on time, and we will wind up with this. My workmen didn't get it, but they finally did make the tusks with the fiberglass wrapped round and round and round and round. Next time, we'll talk about how we mounted the tusks. Again, I'm most anxious for you all to understand or to appreciate how much complexity there is in what seems like a very simple project. So the next one of our journals will be about how we finished up and got onto the desert and had fun at Burning Man. See you all next time.